last hour discussing your article, and we had a lot of great things that came out. We also have a ton of questions for you, so we're gonna dive right into it. But before we do that, I was wondering if you want to tell the students something about you, your interests, your background, even very briefly.
Sure. I'm a historian of the U.S. and the world. I was trained in cultural and intellectual history. Set out on this kind of journey to try to bridge the history of the United States and the history of other parts of the world. And my first book was an attempt to do that with the Philippines and to kind of look at the racial politics of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines and the way that those were affected by the attempt to build a colonial state in Southeast Asia in the early 20th century. And that book ended with kind of looking at Filipino migrants to the United States as byproducts of, or kind of entangled in a set of colonial relationships. And I think that got me interested in the question of, how the question of who was migrating to the United States was shaped by what the United States was doing out in the world. I've been joined in that set of questions by a number of scholars over the last 10 years, especially, who have been exploring this intersection in really exciting ways. And so, so I think my goal in this essay was to, frame that enterprise and to give it a slightly different spin and to kind of, both draw upon the existing scholarship and to kind of point it in some new directions. So, and it's part of a broader book-length project, which is about trying to kind of look at the history of U.S. immigration policy through this kind of geopolitical and imperial lens. So the article that you all read is kind of the methodological introduction to that book. I'm hoping to spare my book readers a long, complicated introduction by kind of pre-publishing it in an article form. And but the goal will be to take readers from the 1870s and 80s and the beginnings of Chinese exclusion all the way through post 9/11 and look at the ways that immigration policy and empire have interacted with each other. So that's what I'm up to.
It sounds really easy.
Yeah, no problem.
They're going to have a lot of questions about some of the things that you've already said, so you'll have an opportunity to elaborate on some of what you just said.
Okay.
So thank you for getting us started.
Sure.
Who wants to go first?
I think mine kind of connects to it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, since you write the article from a geopolitical point of view instead of from an immigration historian's point of view, do you think you have some advantages over immigration historians? Do you think you found some things that they wouldn't have been picked up on?
Yeah, thank you. That's my hope. I mean, I think I've always been someone who likes to test my own expertise and to kind of run to the edges of my own expertise and to kind of become an apprentice in new fields. And this project has definitely involved me. I've always taught immigration history as a person who teaches 19th and 20th century U.S. history, but in terms of really, making that something that I really feel comfortable with, that's becoming conversant in that literature has been really important to me. And at the same time, part of the advantage of being a kind of border crosser when it comes to these fields is the hope that you do bring some new perspectives and some new critiques, some new angles of vision. And that's, certainly something I'm hoping to do with this project. I think if I had to summarize, kind of what I think this approach is bringing that the existing scholarship hasn't necessarily done. One is I think that it's, I feel like the central questions or the central critique of dominant frameworks of immigration history writing have really been about problematizing restriction and exclusion. And with good reason. I mean, in terms of, the kinds of questions that are important to ask, certainly in terms of our present moment, kind of asking when and how and why Americans have restricted immigration, and kind of celebrating open migration or places where the U.S. immigration regime opens up. And I partake in that myself in terms of my own approach to these questions. But I think I've also been struck by, if you foreground a different set of questions, you can also see the ways that the selective migration of certain migrants and the open migration of certain migrants has facilitated projections of American power throughout the world, so that it's not just about who the U.S. is keeping out, but also who it's letting in and why. And so I've been trying to kind of think about, if you put this empire lens onto the story, you become interested in not just the question of who gets in, but you frame that in the question of what the U.S. is trying to do outside in terms of projecting its power and influence in the world. And so that's one thing that I feel like my perspective does that's relatively new. It's not entirely new, but it's kind of, I feel like that approach is emerging within the field. It's kind of on the horizon in a lot of respects. And I think I do that also kind of within the broader framework of thinking about comparatively how great powers have thought about migration as a function of what they're trying to do, whether it's, manage colonies, seize resources, project legitimacy internationally, that migration has not just been something the U.S. instrumentalizes and operationalizes in this way, but it's something that lots of other societies have done too. So part of what I'm trying to do is to take the U.S. immigration story also out of its kind of national frame and to kind of think about it using this empire frame, which in some of my other scholarship I've argued is really the way we need to think about, or one way we need to think about the U.S. and the world. So I'm hoping I add something new and kind of part of what I'm trying to do too is to take things in the literature that we've known for a long time, but to reconceptualize them in new ways. So for example, the section of the essay on enmity at the end, that's where the footnotes, which are kind of obscene throughout the entire essay, get
They noticed that.
Yeah, they're kind of obscene, but they become truly hellacious at the end of the essay. And that's because this is such a well-researched area of study when it comes to the history of race and restriction especially. But what I was realizing is that this idea of enmity as a concept that could organize a lot of forms of restriction that we tend not to put together, and to think about it in terms of war, in terms of who the friend and who the enemy is, that itself was, hopefully adding a new perspective on, and a new angle of vision on histories that are pretty well studied already. So that's the hope with this project.
Thank you.
Sure.
Eric.
Yeah, my question kind of goes off that. Is there anything that you found from sources from the essay that maybe changed your perspective or influenced your own research or understanding in your your main field of imperialism and foreign policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of what this essay was a long journey for me. I mean, I first submitted the draft of this. I kind of wrote the first draft of this in a fever pitch over about 3 weeks, but it was at the end of 2014. And then it was this long process of submitting it to friends to kind of ask them to read it and to wail on it and critique it and, hopefully find a couple of things that were nice that I was doing. And a long peer review process and a lot of revision. And for me, that's part of both the challenge of it and also the fun of it is that in order to write this piece, I had to teach myself and learn a huge amount about the field. And so just making my way through that literature was an education And in terms of things that I learned, I felt like on the one hand, I was trying to communicate some things to, about immigration history that maybe we hadn't fully seen before. But I realized also that, there were stories that I was developing about American power in the world that were also new, that I like to think have things to say to foreign relations historians too. And so foreign relations historians have been very reluctant to get interested in immigration history, which I think for me, in terms of the present day context, I find shocking and puzzling on some level. Although I have my theories as to why that might be the case, but I find the juncture is one that immigration historians, I think, are more excited about in general than foreign relations historians have been. But I think there are lots of things that you can learn about American power in the world in the 20th century by looking at this immigration lens. I mean, just to give one example, one direction that the research is taking me now is looking at sovereignty and looking at how and why and to what limited degree U.S. national control over immigration gets sovereigntized in terms of being monopolized by the federal government. And one of the things that surfaces is that when you look at the U.S. debates about whether to participate in the League of Nations or how to participate in the United Nations, these major 20th century foreign relations debates, immigration is right there at the center of those conversations. I mean, if you look at the Senate, during the League of Nations debates, alongside the fear that some European squabble is going to lead the U.S., to participate in another war, the fear that the League of Nations is going to be able to determine whether Asian migrants can come to the United States is a huge preoccupation, and the same actually happens during during and after World War II with the debates about whether the United States should allow the World Court to adjudicate, to decide what the boundaries of domestic jurisdiction are, and immigration surfaces in that context. And so these are these major moments where the U.S. is debating what kind of role to have in the world. And in those contests, immigration is not absent at all. And so, it's one of those moments where as a researcher, you realize that the absence there is an artifact of the questions historians have chosen not to ask, that it's not an absence that reflects the preoccupations at the time. So that's my goal in part, is to reconstruct some of those linkages in ways that will hopefully have something to say to both intellectual communities.
Thank you. Next.
Joy. I think you kind of started to touch on this a little bit, but how do you see the U.S. kind of influencing immigration policies to benefit themselves right now?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the audio. So how do I see the United States?
Kind of shaping immigration policy for their own benefit today.
Well, I feel like the immigration policy has always been a flashpoint of lots of different conflicting interests in which Americans with different investments and different understandings of society, different economic and political interests clash and try to make sense of immigration in that context. And so it's always been a domain of very intense debate. And those debates are about what kind of society the United States should be, what kind of economy the United States ought to have, and how the U.S. should figure in the world. And I think what a huge part of that calculus has been employers basically thinking about immigration as being in their self-interests, in the sense of the kind of need, particularly during the industrial era, of large-scale unskilled labor forces that would drive down labor costs, weaken unionization, and be vulnerable to corporate discipline. And so, that aspect of kind of self-interest has always been a dominant force, I think, in shaping the field of interests that surround immigration policy. But alongside those and competing with those interests have been, political actors, who have really seen immigration as detrimental, right? And so the long history of labor antagonism towards immigrants and immigration politics, I think, would be important here. And then, the other aspect of this is, which I think speaks to the self-interest in the present, I think, is looking at the political mobilization of immigration in our time as a kind of divide and rule strategy by political demagogues who, have very little to offer everyday Americans beyond a politics of fear and resentment. And so, and I think, I feel like that's something that is relatively new in terms of the intensity and the ferocity with which racist politics are, first of all, being, mobilized through the lens of borders and immigration exclusively or kind of primarily. I think that's something that is, relatively new to the history of U.S. racial politics, at least since the 1920s. And then the kind of, the explicit use of that politics of fear and division in order to, sort of take Americans' attention away from these issues of social justice or redistribution or general, sort of societal well-being. And that's, I think, a clear case where, you have political figures using, not even using immigrants, it's using their fantasies and kind of moral panics about immigrants to what they see as their political advantage. And that, of course, has proven relatively successful in lots of ways over the last few years. So.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm a foreign exchange student here in the U.S. So I was very interested in reading about your part about foreign students and U.S. foreign policy connected to students. And I was just wondering, was this something that the U.S. applied to worldwide back in the days, and is it also something that is present as to this day? Because it's not something that I've thought about prior to coming here, that the U.S. might benefit something from it in terms of soft power or anything like it. Do you have anything more to say about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that was one of the first pieces of this research for me. Actually, started with my interest in looking at international student exchange, and thinking about the ways that the cultivation of student migration was an aspect of American geopolitics, particularly in the mid and late 20th century. But in some ways, particularly in the civil society sphere, the idea that migrant students, would serve certain kinds of global ends, I think was interesting. And I think, the story there is one where it really begins with missionary organizations and with universities, kind of beginning to think about the advantages of cultivating these migrations. And some of the impulse comes from American colonies in the early 20th century, where the sense is that, if you have Filipinos and Puerto Ricans and some Cubans who come to the United States and come to American universities, they'll be impressed by what they see. They'll learn American English. They'll build loyalties and connections to American elites. And then when they go back, they'll be kind of reliable interlocutors in terms of stabilizing, these asymmetric forms of rule the United States is setting up. At least that's the idea. Now, in practice, that doesn't always happen or even frequently happen. That often what happens is that some migrants from the colonies will come to the United States and they'll have very mixed experiences where, they'll appreciate the technological sophistication and but they will have criticisms of, the structure of American society or criticisms of the racism they face or the racism that they see directed against African Americans. And so there's often a kind of alienating effect where the intention is to bring people and then send them back so they can be conduits of influence, but sometimes it backfires. And so, but I got interested in how that idea begins, and then it kind of takes off beginning in the 30s as the U.S. government begins to work with other countries to create programs to bring students to the United States on a temporary basis. And then it really kind of crests between, the 1940s and the 1960s, really, but, between the Fulbright program after World War II and really the catastrophe in Vietnam, I think is really this period of the kind of high tide of a self-consciously governmental effort to cultivate these migrations. And it's very much, the language used of soft power is one that gets developed. That idea that kind of this is a way of exercising power through manipulating legitimacy really reaches its pinnacle, I think, during that period. And then afterwards, a number of things happen. I think there's overall a less of concern with the U.S. as a society whose power needs to be legitimated. I think there's, under Reagan, there's a greater willingness to invoke force and militarization. at the expense of diplomacy and at the expense of soft power approaches. The other thing that happens is privatization, where what happens is that a lot of the student exchange projects, take off in numerical terms, but they're getting organized by private sector agencies and by universities. But I think you can even see, in the post 9/11 context, over the last 20 years, a lot of the debates about immigration and whether the United States needs to securitize its borders or whether it's gone too far have hinged on students. I mean, that comes up again and again with the question of, if the U.S. becomes too much of a fortress and if it over-regulates and over-securitizes, it's going to close out migrant students, who need to come to the United States so they can see American product lines and so they can work for U.S. companies overseas or work in the IT sector in the United States. And so a lot of these arguments about the instrumentality of student migration, I think, have really become even more visible to some extent, as the U.S. has become more restrictionist.
How do you feel about it now? We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
Maybe he's regretting his decision to come now. Other questions? I think someone else had either hand up. Ayushi.
I wanted to know what your initial questions were when you started the research, and if you had some presumptions which changed over the course, just the experience of your research.
Yeah. I wish I could. I need to come up with a narrative that wouldn't drive people crazy. I think on the one hand, this project has been a long time in the making, even before I sat down to try to write it. I mean, I had begun researching and teaching in and around this area for many years before. So if I think about when I really began thinking about this, I mean, it was probably, as far back as 2008 or 9, I think, when I really began to just start reading around in this field and to just look for, connections that historians were making between migration policy and foreign relations. And that was usually the way it was framed. And so it was just kind of gathering. It was a lot of gathering and a lot of reading secondary literature. And then my process is often to just a couple of things. One is I look for patterns. I sort of look for patterns that are not acknowledged within the literature itself or don't rise to the analytic surface of the existing texts. And I look for overarching connections and bridges between literatures that are not being made in the current layout of the scholarship. And I also kind of read with a critical eye to kind of look at things that I think are missing or that the author is underplaying that really need to be brought to the surface more. And so it's that combination of looking for patterns and kind of an overall view of ways of organizing the literature that are not self-evident, that may be counterintuitive in ways that are productive. And then the other is to kind of listen into my own critiques. Like, as I'm reading this literature, and there's, I think we all have this when you read a literature where, you find yourself quarreling with it in particular ways. And if you're lucky, there's a pattern to those arguments you're having. And that is the basis for something creative. That's the basis of something where you can say, actually, I have a different way of looking at this. Maybe I have a different commitment, or I have a different lens that I'm applying to this, and I need to figure out what that lens is and then present that as my contribution. So I think that was a lot of the overall kind of cognitive process of this. And then, in terms of, my main categories, if I think about my kind of geopolitical categories that are kind of at the centerpiece of the essay, I feel like I had those from relatively early on, and those didn't actually shift very much in terms of, as I was reading around, I could see those as the overarching pillars of the piece. But then it was about trying to understand each of them and all of their nuances and all of their kind of complexities. And so I kind of knew that, I was going to have this section on labor, but, initially I don't think I went as far as the present and the kind of recruitment of IT workers. I had more on the 19th century than I had on the 21st century. And so once I had those categories, and I knew those, I would go back and look at the literature and then apply those analytics and say, okay, are these relevant to what actually happened? And try to come up with as complete an account of each of those categories as I could. Another example was with the enmity category, where we have this rich literature on race and ideology, particularly sort of anti-communism and racism in U.S. immigration policy, and so I was able to build my kind of enmity formula, and kind of revisit that scholarship through the lens of this concept of enmity. But it wasn't until relatively late in my research that I realized that, the homophobia that is built into the notions of family in U.S. immigration law really also need to be seen as part of a politics of enmity, that it wasn't just the conventional wartime discussions about a racialized enemy that needs to be contained, but it was also about the notion of sort of non-normative sexualities and genders as being a problem of the U.S. state, that needed to belong in the enmity category. And so it was one of these things where once I had the categories, I then had to go through and kind of be as thorough as I could about seeing all the different places in the immigration policy history where those categories had some kind of purchase. And that was a long, meticulous process.
I think they're all going to go to grad school after this. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I hope I'm not scaring any of you away for this reason. There are other reasons to be scared of grad school, but this is,
I'll let you know. Anyone else want to ask a question? Connor.
Did you see a shift in foreign policy as a result of the 1960s shift of immigration policy?
Sorry, again, with the audio, you said, did I see a shift in U.S. foreign policy?
After 1965, so if you don't mind, because he has a soft voice, the connection between 1965 and foreign policy, right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's certainly a strong set of relationships, and and historians of post-war immigration policy, of whom your instructor is one of the leading exponents, or the people that have done the leading edge research on this. It's very clear that there are foreign policy implications at multiple levels in the early 60s reform conversations. And I think, if you look at the debates about getting rid of the Karen-Walter Act, and, many of them have this foreign policy dimension to it, where it's either about, the inadequacies of the existing refugee system in terms of not giving the U.S. the flexibility it needs to move anti-communist refugees into the United States in the context of crises abroad, particularly in Europe. So the sense of just needing greater administrative flexibility and greater policy flexibility in helping to kind of magnetize and attract anti-communists to the United States, I think is a big part of it. There are at least two other aspects of it. One is the legitimacy part, which is the kind of sense of, by the early 60s with decolonization in Asia and Africa underway, the sense that a kind of explicitly racist formula for deciding who are desirable and undesirable immigrants was not sustainable, that it was going to be counterproductive in terms of the hearts and minds campaigns of that era, and that it gets brought up many times, the kind of sense that, look, our allies, particularly in the decolonizing world, don't like the message that a racist immigration system sends to them, and that is going to make these parts of the world vulnerable to communism, vulnerable to instability, vulnerable to, other kinds of anti-American forces. And so that's, a second aspect. And I think at least the third would be about expertise. And that is the sense that, there's a lot of technical experts, particularly in the European context, that the national security state wants to be able to bring over for weapons technologies. And the sense that a rigid discriminatory system just doesn't it doesn't allow the U.S. to maximize these kind of resources of what we would now call intellectual capital. And so, and those are all, I think, very present in those debates, and alongside the dominant explanations, which have to do with, rightly, the mobilization of immigrant ethnic groups in the second and third generation, and their increasing importance in terms of party politics and asserting themselves within American society. I think those are all incredibly important factors. But I think alongside those, the literature has pointed out that there really is a strong sense that if the U.S. wants to be a certain kind of legitimate worldwide hegemon during an era of rivalry with communism and decolonization, it has to send a different message out to the world. It has to literally put up a different face to the world, and that 1965 is a big part of that. So,
thank you.
Sure.
Is anyone else left?
Okay.
I'm curious about what kind of feedback you've gotten from your article now that it's been out for like almost a year for your essay.
That's a good question. This is going to be another observation that's probably going to frighten all of you away from grad school. So, I think probably the most pleasurable part of publishing is like when you see it in proofs, or like just the moment of publication where it's like you can no longer tinker with it. So, which either makes you very anxious because, there are still things you want to do to it, or you feel relief because it's beyond your grasp anymore. But from there on, it's usually all downhill. And I think that can be for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, we all think our work deserves more attention than it gets. And so that, so there can be a kind of a little bit of a sense of deflation where you publish something that you think is very important and it doesn't meet the audiences that you think it's going to. But I'm going to kind of half joking, but in reality, I mean, I think your articles are very slow to get kind of worked into scholarship. And so it's something I've learned. I'm now mid-career. I've been at this for a while. And actually, my birthday is next week, and I'm hitting a big midlife birthday. So I'm thinking very much about the passage of time. But I have realized that these things take a while to percolate, into a field. And then when they do, they never do in the way you anticipate. And that is, I think, to be, on one level, one can't help but lament that. But I think it's also something to celebrate, that people will find things, ideally, if the work is rich, they'll find things in it that you didn't see in it yourself, and they'll find uses for it that you didn't anticipate. And to me, that's kind of half of the joy of this is when you kind of see something turn up in some anticipated, way. So, I mean, I think in terms of the reaction, I mean, I have a website where I post my stuff for people who might be interested in it. The piece has been downloaded a lot. Some of that could be hate downloading as opposed to, but I think time will tell. I think that's just one of those things where, and I think as a scholar, my goal is to kind of move on with the project and move on with other projects, and to kind of, when I get the occasional sighting of this project out in the world and it's thriving and people are doing interesting things with it, that'll make me happy. But I mean, for example, like I'm so honored that Maddalena assigned my piece to you all, and honored that you all took the time to read it and to ask thoughtful questions. I mean, this is really, when I was talking about, the negative side of publishing and kind of, wondering if any of this matters. I mean, what we're doing right now for me is the absolute pinnacle of the best part of publishing. So I want to thank you guys for that.
Thank you for giving us a rich conversation about an amazing piece. We only have about a couple of minutes left, and I want to bring it to the present. I think I mentioned it to you while we spoke earlier. So you have these reference at the beginning about homegrown fascists versus the foreign threat, right? And it has to do with your enmity section too. So how do we carry that story into the present? So what do we do with this history, and how does it help us understand the mess that we're in right now?
Yeah. Well, this is the big question, and this is one I've been grappling with in some of my kind of more public writing a lot over the last couple of years, especially. I mean, when I first drafted this, I mean, it was in 2014, and immigration was not kind of on the forefront, and so I was writing this for nerdier kind of reasons. I mean, nothing I write doesn't have a kind of political question at the heart of it, but this was a political question that came out of longer kind of commitments and questions. It was not kind of headline kind of stuff. And then I began to present it during the 2016 election, and those lines in the beginning about the idea that immigrants coming over were subversives who were going to subvert American society, and the kind of need to create a fortress America were those were really jumping out in new kinds of ways. And I on the one hand, I think the challenge for me with this piece was to write a piece that would be haunted by the present, and kind of maybe give us some tools for sharpening our analysis of the present and kind of giving it some clarity and some historicity. But I did not want it to be a piece that dated instantaneously, by just seeing to speak to the kind of crisis that we're in around immigration. And so I think particularly with the enmity section, that became much sharper in my own mind through thinking about the ways that nativism was getting mobilized in new ways during the campaign and since. I think just something about the, reflecting on what this was doing politically and how it was operating helped give a certain kind of clarity and force to that section in particular. In terms of, one of the things that I think is interesting that the piece, I think, maybe suggests kind of quietly is, and this was one of my friends and colleagues who read the piece said that what really struck him about the kind of 6 geopolitical categories is that most of them are promoting migration. So only kind of 1 out of the 6 of them, if you think about kind of labor, diffusion, legitimacy, these are all kind of pushing in the direction of greater sort of migration openness. And it's really only the enmity section that is driven by a restrictionist politics. And so in a way, that itself, I think, is kind of interesting to think about the ways in which a lot of the kind of positive, affirmative but imperial rationales for immigration are completely absent from the current regime. And that, I think, is really striking, that previous administrations, had strong restrictionist and deportationist elements, right? And here, of course, it's really important that Obama was the deporter in chief. I mean, he kind of, not ostentatiously, quietly deported many, many people in ways that was not as flagrant and, not as politically advertised as Trump. But there's something also about the ways in which Trump has redefined the politics of immigration entirely through the lens of enmity, which I think is really striking. And so, I think in terms of the ways I've tried to intervene in the kind of conversation to the limited extent that we can, I think I've been trying to kind of thread this needle where on the one hand, I've been arguing with the kind of pro-immigration advocates with whom I'm very sympathetic. And actually, I myself have, been involved in immigrant rights activism, continue to be. But the argument that has also been raised in public saying this is not who we are. America is a nation of immigrants. We are an inclusive country. Trump is the anomaly. Trump is the exception. I don't think that's historically sustainable. I can see why you would want to do that. It sounds great. It makes you feel really good in terms of, trying to mobilize a patriotic kind of argument against what Trump is trying to achieve. But as a historian, that sort of trips off every alarm bell about kind of using the past for presentist purposes. So I, on the one hand, I don't want to deny, the people whose side I'm on in these debates a rhetorical resource, but I also want to make sure that we're doing justice to the past. I mean, the part of me that is a historian and thinks historically and wants to act politically in a historically responsible way. And so what I've been trying to do is to kind of say, look, there have been these countervailing traditions, and the traditions that are not coherent either, but kind of big and shaggy and complicated, that have been fighting over immigration in more sort of open and more closed kinds of ways throughout U.S. history, and to provide a kind of history that will give the advocates of immigrant rights a history they can use. And of course, there's a very robust history of both immigrants and Americans and immigrant Americans, pushing to redefine the United States as an inclusionary society, and as one that makes room for immigrants and protects immigrant rights, that has a very expansive notion of American political society. So those resources are there to be studied, and those were not perfect, and we shouldn't try to just dust them off and revamp them. They need to be altered and critiqued at the same time. And to also make clear that there's a deep nativist history too, and to kind of make sure that we don't, anomalize Trump, and to kind of say he's a surface growth that is, easily going to be uprooted. I think in a way, when we do that, we not only fail to do justice to the history and to the people who've struggled against nativism and racism in the past, but we also are likely to underestimate the obstacles and underestimate the challenges that we're facing in terms of pushing against racist authoritarianism, and to sort of say, look, Trumpian nativism comes out of, at the very least, debates about, immigrants, job competition, the welfare state, that date back to the 1970s, at least, exacerbated by the politics of militarization and securitization since 9/11. And so the notion that there are deep roots here, and that we need to attend to kind of why this is as powerful as it has become, I think means taking those histories very, very seriously. So that's what I'm hoping to do with some of this work.
Thank you so much. We're all out of time. Our class is actually over in 5 minutes.
Okay.
We're really, really grateful. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
We'll see you in January.
All right. See you in January. Bye-bye.